Welcome to Honors World History. Today we're going to try to dive in and tackle the beginning of Chinese history in the first approximately 2,000 years of Chinese dynasties. This is going to be problematic for a whole host of reasons. I mean, honestly, mostly because you're talking about 2,000 years of history that we're going to try to cover in about a 15-minute video. So I'm going to overly simplify things, leave a bunch of stuff out, and just try to hopefully give you a narrative that allows you to recognize some of the trends that we see in Chinese history over time. So when we get to the time periods that we're actually spending more time on, 13, 1400s and after, you can recognize where a lot of these things came from. I should also say that I'm going to pronounce everything incorrectly. And so keep in mind as we move into this East Asia unit, my pronunciation of non-Western things is never great. And it's going to be much worse here for China because, yeah. The tones, it's problematic. So here's our objectives for today. Take a moment, take them in, and let's dive into our story. Chinese civilization began along the Yellow River in northern China. The Yellow River gets its name from the silt in the river that gives it a yellowish color. It's a relatively curvy river that covers a significant amount of what is today northern China. It's also a relatively tempestuous river in that it floods somewhat regularly and disastrously. And when it floods, it often floods with pretty significant intensity, leading to significant destruction of land, often destruction of life. And so the flooding of the Yellow River has been one of the factors in Chinese history that often leads to periods of instability and sometimes governmental change. As far as Chinese geography, most of Chinese civilization, as we know it, started in the Chinese Plain region of northern China there, right along where the Yellow River sort of flows into the Pacific Ocean. So a significant amount of Chinese history is going to happen there, and then China over time is going to expand westward and southward into some other regions. Chinese society has almost always been inwardly facing throughout most of Chinese history. The oceans and bays and gulfs surrounding China are relatively large, and the civilizations around China traditionally have been not as developed as the Chinese. And so for the most part, the Chinese have been somewhat disinterested in traveling to other places because they view themselves as the center of civilization, and they are mostly interested in the things that are happening within China. Chinese history is told based on this story or this cycle called the dynastic cycle, starting with the probably mythical Xia Dynasty. The story of the Zhou Dynasty is the story of Yu the Great, who was able to tame the floods of the Yellow River. The story is that he set his entire life to creating sort of works to tame the floodwaters of the Yellow River and was willing to sacrifice pretty much all his other duties for the goods of the people in order to make sure that the Yellow River would stop flooding and people would be able to live there in peace. This story demonstrates the dedication that Chinese leaders should show to their people, and it's one that sort of establishes the role of a proper leader, of how people claim the mandate of heaven and get the right to rule by showing this sort of dedication. So take a moment, read the story of Yu the Great or Yu the Engineer, and we'll move on. The story about the Xia Dynasty, which we know almost nothing about and may not have happened, is that for a while they ruled appropriately, tamed the Yellow River, things like that. And then, as you can see, over time, the Xia kings became less loyal or less responsible. They worried about worldly pleasures, and the story of the last Xia king is that he had his followers create a lake of alcohol and a forest of sort of roasted meat so he could float around on a boat and drink and eat all day. And this caused the heavens to send down calamities, disaster to strike the Xia dynasty, and for the Xia dynasty to be replaced with the not legendary Shang Dynasty. So, Wine Lake Meat Forest leads to collapse of your dynasty. Then you've got the Shang Dynasty here in northern China. We're starting to see a little bit of population growth, especially in northern China here under the Shang Dynasty. The Shang Dynasty is another dynasty that up until, about 100 years ago was also believed to be mostly mythical in that we didn't have any hard historical facts to sort of substantiate it until we discovered the oracle bones. The oracle bones were a series of carvings done on bones and turtle shells that would then be burned through a divination process known as pyromancy. This would allow the kings of Shang to ask questions of the gods, and then their oracles could read the cracks on these bones, and it would tell them the future. And so here's an example of what that looks like. Take a moment, pause, and read. And so the Shang Dynasty, what we know about them is somewhat limited. We know about the things that they cared about. We know they had these oracle bones. And the story of the fall of the Shang Dynasty is that we have another wine pool and meat forest created by the last king of Shang, which led to him losing the mandate of heaven, eventually being overthrown and replaced by a new dynasty. This cycle, which was described first during the Zhou Dynasty, about both how the Shang came to power and how they fell from power, it becomes known as the dynastic cycle. So here's the basic process of the dynastic cycle, with the idea that if rulers rule well, they keep the mandate of heaven, calamities are not sent, and the dynasty continues. If rulers rule poorly, calamities come. Rebellions happen, the dynasty is overthrown, and a new dynasty claims the mandate of heaven and reunites the Middle Kingdom. So the Zhou Dynasty is the one that we know the most about. King Wu of Zhou founded the Zhou Dynasty. He unified a significantly larger geographical region of northern China. And in the Zhou Dynasty, we get some of our most famous figures in Chinese history. For example, the Duke of Zhou provides an example of what proper advisors and rulers should do. He was the son of the king of Zhou, and but he was not the heir. And so when the king died, he was the regent over the heir to the throne, and he ruled wisely and helped raise the future emperor until he eventually ascended to the throne. And so the Duke of Zhou represents a honest statesman who ruled wisely and then gave up power when it was time to. And so he's going to be used as a moral example by a guy named Confucius, once we get to him, as far as how proper subjects should behave. The Zhou Dynasty also gave us a much more complex social class pyramid that's going to be established here, with the top, the ruling class, being the kings, the priests, the lords, things like that. Then you've got the working classes, the scholars and the soldiers, the farmers, the craftsmen, and the traders below them. This is going to replace the sort of two-tiered ruling class of the Shang Dynasty, and this is going to establish a couple things in Chinese history that are important to know. One, the importance of scholar officials. Scholar officials are going to be really important through Chinese history, and they're going to come up again and again and again. And secondarily, the lack of importance of merchants, who are going to be at the bottom of the social pyramid. This is going to be further articulated by Confucius, who was a scholar official, so might have had some stake in the game about the layering of these social classes. And so this is going to be maintained throughout most of our Chinese dynastic history. This whole idea of the mandate of heaven also comes out of the Zhou period. So here's Mencius, who's going to articulate how the mandate of heaven works. Take a moment, pause, and read. This, of course, further emphasizes that appropriate ruling leads to good outcomes, leads to the dynasty continue to being propagated. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy about how the mandate of heaven is maintained through proper actions and the mandate of heaven is lost through improper actions. The Zhou dynasty collapsed into the Warring States period near the sort of middle period of the Zhou kings. The famous story is that the Emperor Yu had this one wife that he really, really liked but could not make her smile or make her happy. And so Emperor Yu tried everything possible in order to appease this wife that he loved so much. The one thing that he found that would make her happy is that they had a system of sort of watch fires across mountains that they would light when the Zhou dynasty was under attack, and soldiers would then rush in from the provinces to defend the capital. So what Emperor Yu discovered is that his wife really loved it when he would light these fires and the army would rush in, and then she would just laugh and laugh and laugh. And so he would do this repeatedly to bring the army in and make her happy. When the army showed up all of these times and nothing was actually happening and there was no emergency, they were pretty upset about this. And so, similar to the story of the boy who cried wolf, eventually what happened is a group invaded the the Zhou Dynasty, and came and was threatening the capital. The emperor then lit the fires to try to bring the army in to defend them. And of course, this time the army, thinking that it was just another attempt to appease his wife, did not show up. The capital was sacked, and the Zhou Dynasty fell out of power. And so this began the Warring States period and is, of course, an important morality tale in Chinese history. During the Warring States period, the Zhou Dynasty technically still ruled. The king still was in power, but almost all of the actual authority fell to these local sort of provinces. No one was actually paying any attention to what was going on and what the king was doing. And so these local warlords, for the most part, had power. The Zhou dynasties ostensibly maintained control through what's called the Spring and Autumn period, until eventually a dynasty called the Qin Dynasty rose to power. They started as sort of a tiny little state out in the west, and then over time grew in power and influence until the Qin Dynasty unified all of China and got the mandate of heaven, and became a new dynasty. Zheng, the first king the king of Qin, then declared himself emperor or son of heaven, taking a title of king over kings, and he began to rule now as what we call the emperor. So the emperor of China is going to rule over all the petty kingdoms. He is going to adopt a system of very strict laws called legalism that is going to create a system of very harsh laws and punishments to try to keep order. This was a reaction to the chaos of the Warring States in the Spring and Autumn period. And so Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, is going to adopt, again, very, very harsh rules and punishments, with the punishment for most infractions being torture and eventual death. Legalism becomes one of these key Chinese philosophies that we're going to have to know for later. So here's the description of legalism. Take a moment and read. Chinese rulers alternate between these systems, including legalism, throughout a lot of Chinese history. And so Qin Shi Huang's rule is one of, again, legalism, harsh laws, and he is also going to build the Great Wall to try to stop incursions from northern barbarians. So the first Chinese Great Wall was built through forced labor during the Qin Dynasty. And then Qin Shi Huang is going to get obsessed with the afterlife. He's going to build a fabulous tomb complex for himself. He's going to fill it with the famous terracotta soldiers that you might be familiar with to theoretically serve him after death. And as he got increasingly old, he's also going to search for immortality elixirs. And he's going to have his doctors try to create some sort of thing that he could drink, some sort of elixir that would prolong his life and make him immortal. And eventually, they're going to give him something that's mostly mercury and arsenic, which is going to spectacularly kill him. His son is going to struggle to maintain power. And honestly, the system of legalism is going to be really problematic. As you can see here, Liu Bang was a Chinese guy who was responsible for escorting a group of laborers to construct the mausoleum. During the journey, the prisoners escaped, and under Qin law, allowing prisoners to escape was punishable by death. So Liu Bang, rather than returning himself to the government to be summarily executed, rebelled and started a movement that would eventually destroy the Qin Dynasty. Liu Bang and his followers swept away the unpopular Qin, and he would seize power, take over the city of Shenyang, the capital, and would become the new ruler of this new dynasty called the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty is one of the most important dynasties in Chinese history. They established a lot of what it is and what it means to be Chinese. They're especially going to adopt new ethical systems, abandoning legalism, and instead turn towards a lesser-known scholar official of the Spring and Autumn period of the Zhou Dynasty called Confucius. So Liu Bang becomes the first emperor of the Han Dynasty. And he's going to adopt this system of Confucianism. Confucius was a scholar official who did a series of writings during the Zhou Dynasty. And during the Han Dynasty, these are going to become official policy. Confucianism is based off of five relationships that have similar similar responsibilities to each other: ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife, and elder to younger sibling. The older or more responsible one is supposed to guide and protect the younger, and the younger is supposed to show loyalty and obedience to the older. And then, of course, the friend-friend relationship. People are supposed to treat others the way they would like to be treated. So these rules, if Confucius argued that if you followed these rules and knew the sort of lessons of Chinese history, we could maintain the golden ages of Chinese history, where the ruler had the mandate of heaven and everything was stable for as long as is possible. This was eventually codified into an imperial examination system in which people who wanted to serve at the Chinese court would have to demonstrate their knowledge of Chinese history and Confucian principles in order to rule. And this sort of proto-Mandarin system would ensure that the people that the emperor surrounded himself with had knowledge of history and ethics to be able to advise the emperor to rule well. And so this is going to establish a stable bureaucracy for China, allowing them to survive a lot of really unpleasant periods of a lot of unpleasant periods of less than capable emperors. Confucian moral tales also teach people how to act. Probably my favorite one is the parable of the filial son. So the story is a young man was taking care of his ailing father when hard times struck his farm. This young man was concerned that he could no longer feed his father, so he got his son, put his father onto a wheelbarrow or onto a pallet, and carried him out into the woods to abandon him to die. After abandoning his father, the man and his son were walking back, and the son remarked to the father, "Make sure to keep that wheelbarrow, father, for when you get old, I'll use it to dump you in the woods when we can't care for you anymore." Thus the man realized that he was setting a bad example to his son about how to treat your elders, so he went and retrieved his father, begged his forgiveness, and cared for him the rest of his life. This helps to reinforce Confucian values and helps to demonstrate sort of the importance of honoring these various relationships and filial piety, respect for your elders. During the Han Dynasty, we get a bunch of Chinese sort of cultural developments. Papermaking happens during this period. We get new farming techniques, new mills, new different types of plows, development of wheelbarrows, harnesses, things like that. We also get mining advances and all of these other things. The first comprehensive Chinese history was written by Sima Guang here, who is going to be sort of the father of Chinese history, what Herodotus is to the Greeks. His classic of history is the Shu Jing, is going to tell the story of the previous Chinese dynasties, and is going to be one of course, the important things the Chinese scholar officials are going to need to read. And so during the Western Han Dynasty, Chang'an was the capital of the Han Dynasty. They maintained the Great Wall. We had this awesome golden age of Confucianism, technology, and wealth spreading throughout China. And China was, again, one of the centers of the world at this point. The Silk Road was opened and trade flourished across sort of Eurasia, and life was good. And then, right around the year 0, Wang Mang came to power. He was a scholar official who wanted to rule himself. And so he continued to manipulate a series of weak emperors in order to push and increase his own power in order to seize power for himself. He was given a series of gifts known as the 9 bestowments, which originally were designed for the emperor to show respect and gratitude towards his followers and his key officials. And now, after Wang Mang, sort of become the things that someone gets or asks for when they want to usurp the throne. It's a pattern that demonstrates their capability before they seize power for themselves. Wang Mang found a series of mysterious rocks that claimed that he should be emperor. These rocks had like red writing on them that proclaimed that the gods wanted Wang Mang to seize the throne. And so he's going to rise up and take control over the empire. He's going to try to redistribute land. He's going to try to push a new system of currency where he's creating these things called knife coins for some reason in order to stabilize the currency of China. And it's going to lead to spectacular peasant uprisings, and his new Qin Dynasty is going to be very short-lived. Wang Mang's name is going to become synonymous with usurpation throughout the rest of Chinese history. He's going to be overthrown, and the Han Dynasty is going to come back to power temporarily. However, much like the late Zhou Dynasty during the Warring States and Spring and Autumn period, the emperor in Chang'an is going to have limited power, and instead local warlords are going to control most everything. Eventually, a warlord named Dong Zhou is going to seize control of the seize control of the emperor and make a play for power himself, leading to an uprising called the Yellow Turban Uprising. The Yellow Turbans lead to the famous Three Kingdoms period, immortalized in Chinese literature. The fight between Lu Biao, Cao Cao, and Sun Quan is going to sort of dominate this period as these three men try to form alliances and reunify China. They first fight against Dong Zhou, overthrowing him and getting rid of his tyrannical reign. And then they fight each other for a while, with none of the three states being able to gain power over the others. And so the struggle between the state of Wei, controlled by Cao Cao, the state of Wu, controlled by Sun Quan, and the state of Shu, controlled by Lu Biao, is going to dominate this period of Chinese history. Cao Cao looks as if he's going to be able to win. He was a fabulous strategist and incredibly, skilled military general. Although his fleet is destroyed at the Battle of Red Cliffs, and the stalemate between the two sides is going to continue. Eventually, there's a northern and southern period where the northern China is united by one dynasty and southern China is united by another. And eventually, the Sui Dynasty, a couple hundred years later, finally unites all of China. This period of disunity is going to bring in new sort of philosophies into China, specifically Taoism and Buddhism, which we're going to talk about next time. And the Sui Dynasty is going to be very short-lived, similar to the Qin Dynasty. So Qin Dynasty. They're going to adopt legalism as a framework, and they're going to rule relatively harshly and use a lot of forced labor, which is going to alienate people and lead to another uprising. And so that's just a brief overview of Chinese history. My sincerest apologies for a lot of mispronunciations and for skipping through a lot of stuff. But hopefully this gives you just a sense of the first 2,000 years of Chinese history. We'll slow down slightly next time and talk about the Tang, Song, and Yuan dynasties before really slowing down and diving into the Ming dynasty. So thank you for listening. We'll be back with more Chinese dynasties